everyone. We'll make this quick today. We won't go with any animations or anything like that. I'll just keep talking all the way through each one of these slides and you take notes where you need them. If you have any questions concerning what you find in this lecture, email me, reach out to me in class, or come to my office hours. But if this works out, we might do this again in the future. So hopefully it does. Alrighty, so today we're building again off that idea of management, but we're tacking on a different concept of motivation. And before I start and get into this, I do want to note that both of these things are really, really broad, and again, we're doing the superficial part of this. And motivation, of course, is a really, really deep concept, but it might trigger some ideas for you all in your newsletter briefs. So if you find it interesting or you think you might want to dig deeper, you can also think about how you might tie motivation into what you're going to do for future activities in this class. Excuse me, that was my phone. Shame on me. Alrighty, so let's get moving. So just to give you an overview today, we're going to be talking more again about behavior in the classroom and how to increase acceptable behavior. We're going to talk about prompts, which are things that we already habitually use and you've seen a lot in this class. We'll talk about reinforcers, which are a pretty fragile concept, and so we'll talk about that a bit. Different guidelines, and then motivation very broadly. So of course we want to increase responsible behavior in the classroom. So one of the things that you can do as a teacher is to model acceptable behavior and make sure that you acknowledge when acceptable behavior is being performed. So this is the idea that kids are going to learn from what you do. Use reinforcement. So again, that's about acknowledging, pointing out when things are done well, and making sure that the children or your students know that they are performing responsible behavior. Make sure you give your students time to reflect. So if behavior is not responsible, or even if it is, make sure that you give your students the chance to think about what was actually done. Allow for sharing. This is pretty different than the forced sharing that I make you all do in class. Just kidding. But make sure you allow time for sharing because young kids really love that. And again, we've talked about this a lot, this idea of autonomy or allowing your students choice. So present options to your student within bounds that are comfortable to you as the teacher. And then again, make sure that you create opportunities. So organize your class or the activity that you're doing so that you're creating an opportunity for your students to display responsibility. So moving on to this concept of prompts. Prompts are things that we do all the time and we've heard from day one. And they're basically just statements that tell students what to do, basically what you want them to do. And there's modeling, there's verbal prompts, and there's nonverbal prompts. So modeling falls into that demonstration category. So again, they're going to learn from what you do. So what you do in terms of modeling a behavior, they will do. Verbal prompts are really short statements that tell your students what they want to do. So hustle, come here, eyes on me, head up if you're teaching motor skills, knees up. Just very short, brief prompts. Nonverbal prompts are gestures that we use often and things that your students understand without verbal language. So this idea of maybe saying slow down by pumping your hands up and down towards the floor, like slow down. Or in class when I think it was Brianna doing her lesson plan and she was a little bit close to the timeline, and so I gave her the signal with my hand across my throat, like, all right, let's cut it off here. So that was a nonverbal prompt and she picked up on it right away. Now this idea of reinforcing behavior, not that we're going to get into this too much, but I do want you to know that when you reinforce behavior with rewards, it can be fragile. But what we'll talk about here is just what you see on this slide, just briefly. Using reinforcers to help promote acceptable behavior. So there's different types of reinforcers. There's social reinforcers, activity reinforcers, and extrinsic reinforcers. So social reinforcers are just simple words of praise or gestures of praise. Okay, so activity reinforcers would be like if your students are behaving well and they're being responsible, you give them the opportunity to play a game that they really love. That's a really great way to trick young kids into being physically active. Not that we're always aiming to trick kids, but it's a good way to get people being active. Extrinsic reinforcers are giving your students things like golden stars for good behavior, or a sticker, or some other kind of external extrinsic reward for their behavior. And this is the part that I'm talking about that we can consider fragile. Because sometimes if you give too many extrinsic rewards, kids become less interested in the activity. So we just want to keep our eyes peeled for that. We want to monitor that as best that we can. Okay, so again, monitoring behavior as closely as possible is really important. So again, you all have to be superheroes and be able to see everything, hear everything, anticipate everything, and we're calling that with-itness. So basically, you're so in tune with the events that are happening and the things that are about to happen that you're going to prevent them from happening. So basically, body language, pattern master, and eyes in the back of your head, and being able to multitask are the key things that make you a with-itness superhero. So the one thing that you probably are not familiar with is pattern master, and what we mean by that is just you look for these consistent patterns of students that might hint towards poor behavior or misbehaving students. And this is what we talked about in class on Tuesday. We talked about the levels of responsibility and helping your students understand that. So this is just a reminder here. And one of the things that we talked about was the way that you can display this information so that your students understand, making sure that when they have exhibited some poor behavior, that you can present them with an opportunity to reflect and say, okay, how responsible were you? Level 1 or level 0 through 4. And this is just a quick example. I said you can use figures. Using smiley faces is generally across cultures pretty easy to interpret, and across ages as well. So this is a quick and easy way to do it. So again, when there is poor behavior, we have to have some consequences. And we talked last time about being consistent in this and not having favorites and all these sorts of things. So revisit that information that we discussed. But this is about decreasing unacceptable behavior. So you first want to try reprimands. Well, not first, but that's just one thing. You can try reprimands. But first you have to be able to identify what the unacceptable behavior is. And you have to actually identify it to the children, to your students. And you have to tell them why it was unacceptable. And then you have to remind them what they should be doing. So again, I think that this is something that we do habitually with younger children. But if you find that poor behavior is being repeated often, try this, because maybe they don't know what the desired behavior is because it hasn't been said to them specifically. Okay. And then the big threat of removing positive consequences. So if children are behaving well and they're being very responsible students, they're going to get rewarded by the things that we talked about just a few slides ago. So if you remove those from your students and you don't give them the chance to have those things, then that is also a consequence. I remember, this is not a lie. It's probably going to extend this talk longer than you want to, but when I was in 3rd grade, we used to walk in 2 lines from my class out to the field where we played kickball for PE. And we were in our 2 lines, and my teacher was at the front of the line, and I was about in the middle. And I see this rock come sailing from the back of the line, and it hits my teacher right on the back of his head. It was a pretty big rock, pretty bad behavior. I don't know why we were throwing rocks. He turns around, gets very angry with us, marches us back into the class because no one would fess up to throwing the rock. And we didn't have PE for a really, really long time because someone wasn't acting right and they were being irresponsible and throwing rocks in the air. Fast forward to when I'm 20 years old, talking to one of my friends about that experience and how much it was a bummer to not have PE. And that person says, "Wait, we didn't have PE because someone threw a rock at his head?" And I said, "Yeah, it was just one rock, one time, and we didn't get PE." And that person goes, "Oh my gosh." And I said, "What?" And they go, "I threw that rock, and I didn't know that that's what I was being punished for." So I got really mad at that friend of mine, but just kidding. It was all in good fun, but it was a bummer not to have PE. So if you remove that positive consequence, the chance of having activity It's going to make an impact on your students, and they will remember not to throw rocks. All right, using guidelines. So this is more for you than maybe the student. Maybe it's a dual purpose, but using a process to deal with misbehavior. So this is a way to keep yourself in check and making sure that you are consistent with how you treat your students when they do misbehave. So this is just an example. You can walk yourself through these, but there are four levels here, and these are going to vary depending on the situation and depending on what class you're teaching, how many students you have, and all these sorts of things. But I would recommend coming up with your own guidelines that may be modeled after this, but just think about what might be best for you in the situation that you're in and stick to it. So conflict resolution. There again, this is something I'm presenting to you with multiple steps. So there's 6 steps to conflict resolution. And the first step is to immediately stop the aggressive behavior. And this is specifically about aggression or aggressive behavior. But you want to stop it. You want to immediately quit whatever is causing all the trouble. The second step, sorry for my cursor in the middle there. The second step is to try and understand what happened. And this is again going to help you in the future with anticipating future events. And make sure you give your students the chance to have a voice with this one. And the third step is to try and brainstorm some solutions. And here, this is again where you're giving your students autonomy. You're giving them the chance to have a choice or some freedom to think of ideas or to demonstrate responsibility in terms of identifying good solutions. But again, you're the boss, so figure out if they match with what you think would be best. The fourth step is to test these solutions. Just to make sure that all students buy into it, because sometimes you're going to come up with a solution that you think is top-notch and it just doesn't work, so you've got to be flexible. Step 5 is to help them implement this. So they might come up with the solution, you might have figured out which one works best, but make sure they're sticking to it. And then step 6 is, again, the reflection idea that we've talked about in this class before. So being proactive. I think we all know this term, but I want you to give some time to thinking about what this means in terms of when you have poor behavior in the classroom. So basically what we mean here is that you're really trying to prevent bad behavior. You're trying to anticipate it as best you can. And there's a few points we'll point out that helps you be a proactive instructor. So if you have really clear and detailed plans, there's less room for poor behavior. If you are really prepared, obviously you're going to be better able to handle things when they go poorly. Make sure you follow up and you're not just addressing it and then moving on. Make sure you follow up. If you must call home, then you definitely should do it. There's a few really good BuzzFeed articles out there that say these are the greatest notes sent home to parents ever, so look that one up. Maybe I'll email it all to you. And then have a plan for, when things don't really go the way you expected. So now we're moving into motivation. Sorry, I'm not in presenter view, so this is a little bit sloppy in terms of the slides, but this is the best I can do. So now we're talking about motivation. Again, big topic, but we're glossing the surface in elementary ed. So this is just a little food for thought, just thinking about what actually motivates you and then thinking about this question from the perspective of your students. And for everybody, it's going to be different. For a whole group, it's going to be different. So just think about that big picture. Don't spend too much time on this, but do know that it's different from one person to the next. And I feel like I say that almost every single day, but it is an important question to consider. Okay, so when we're talking about the 5 stages of change, we're talking about behavioral change. And this comes from the trans-theoretical model. And that's what we're going to finish talking about today. So we're going to go through each one of these steps. And what you can see from this model, or these 5 stages of change, is that it can be cyclical. Okay, so this arrow at the bottom here, cycling back up to pre-contemplation, indicates that it is a cyclical model. Okay, so we'll go through each one of these fairly briefly. So the first stage is pre-contemplation. So we're talking about consciousness raising activities where students are learning about ways that they can change their behavior. So, or the benefit of changing their behavior. So we can think about, teaching children about why it's important to be physically active. You're piquing their interest here. Okay, so the second one is contemplation. This is where your students are actually thinking about change. They're more aware of what they can do, and they're more willing to change. So they're actually thinking about it. But a lot of the time action isn't taken. So this is why when we say procrastination occurs in this phase, that's what we mean. Okay. The third stage is preparation. And this is where students are planning to start exercising. So maybe you help them as your instructor to create a plan, or you set one out for them that they begin to understand and buy into as their own. But this is where the planning occurs, so preparation and planning. The fourth stage is action. So they actually make an effort in whatever the change is that they identified. So in this case, we're saying we're teaching children about being physically active, or we're teaching them about the importance of exercise, and that got them thinking about it. Then we help them create a plan, and then we actually implemented that, and they actually showed motivated behavior, and they really bought into it. Now they're being physically active. But the fifth stage is really the most important, and maybe where motivation really ties in most is with maintenance. So again, this is a motivational model, but think about each part and how motivation plays a role. But then think about that fifth stage and maybe how you might be affected by this in certain aspects of your life too. But maintaining something is hard. It's really hard. Like what's the saying? It's harder to be at the top than it is to get at the top. So once you're there, once you're that physically active individual, we want to make sure that this turns into a habit. So helping students maintain that is critical. Outstanding motivating teachers, that's you all. ICE-T is the acronym, okay? So outstanding teachers are inviting. They challenge their students, and they also encourage their students. So that's a very fine line there. And they not only teach them what, but they teach them how. So when you think about your own personal philosophy as a teacher, consider if these things are things you value, because what science tells us is that these are the things that matter. Okay, this is just a general idea about motivation. Your student interest in a topic or a conversation or discussion or anything that you're doing activity-wise. Interest is higher when whatever you're doing has a mastery component to it. And what we mean by the term mastery is that we're focused on the process, and we're focused more so on developing a skill. So here we say goal set for a whole class and work done to get everyone on the same level. So here, goal set for the whole class. So we're all contributing to a whole final goal, but in order to achieve it, we all have to contribute smaller parts, right? Okay, so also interest is higher when you just provide a slew of things. So you give them change, you give them variety, you show them new things, you present them with that choice again, and you often set goals. So I would even say set daily goals with your students. What are we going to do today? Can we check that box at the end of the day? Okay, your students are going to be more interested in that than they would be if you did not. Use heterogeneous groups. What we mean by that is really diverse groups. As often as you can, you want to use diverse groups because this presents your students with an opportunity to learn. And when we say diverse and heterogeneous, we mean a number of things. The diversity spans a number of things, and one of them that we have talked about in this class is we've talked about stature, weight and stature, and that might not apply here, right? So if we're doing physical activity, you might not want to match students up with someone who's 2 times their size, which can happen in an elementary school. So think about that term and how that might be best used, how diversity might be best used in your classroom and when you're teaching physical activity and health. But also keep in mind the things that we've talked about before. So again, you've got to be superhero teachers and have all this in your noggin. It's not easy. And we talked about providing rewards and incentives already and making sure that you monitor the students' responses to this because they may become passive if it's done too much. And last but not least, of course, is to make everything fun if you can. And that takes a lot of energy from you as the teacher. But that's hopefully something you all find rewarding in itself. Alrighty, so that's it from me. We kind of hustled through that quickly, and I'm sorry it might not have been the most thrilling. So I'm looking forward to your feedback if you all are willing to send it my way. And if something didn't work out so well, do let me know. And if you have questions, again, email me. All right, I hope you all have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.